In this tutorial, we will review how to edit a raw file in Lightroom. So I'm starting here with this raw file of a landscape scene, and I am in the basic editing panel over here in Develop. And there's a whole bunch of things that I can do with this file since it was not automatically processed by my camera, which is what happens when you shoot in JPEG. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the white balance in the image. And what's stored here is as shot, so as it was set up in the camera, but I have a lot of latitude with how I can play with white balance in a raw file. I can click on this as shot menu and it'll actually apply the settings that are presets in the camera to the scene. So we could scroll through those and see how it changes. So you can see that this is sort of a cloudy day, so the cloudy white balance actually looks pretty good. I can look at shade, which warms it up a little bit too much. In tungsten and fluorescent, this is going to adjust it for ambient lamp lighting, so that's actually not going to be appropriate for the image. But you can click through those and you can use those presets if you wish. I'm going to go back to cloudy, because I liked that effect. Now you can use this as a jumping off point for white balance. You can then go to the temperature slider, or you don't even have to use a preset. You can go directly to the temperature slider, and if you slide to the left, you can cool down the white balance of the image. You can make it very cool, so it's almost blue, or you can warm things up a little bit. And you can double click the word temp to bring it back to where it was. So I don't think I'm going to do too much. I might cool it down a little bit. There's a third option for setting your white balance, where you can grab this the white balance selector, this eyedropper icon right here, and you can bring it right into the image, and you can pick a target neutral. So this refers to any white or black or gray point in the image that you'd like to use as a neutral tone. So this sort of bright area where the moving water is blended together, it's making a nice white tone. I'm going to choose that as my white neutral. If I click on that, you can see that it just cooled things down a little bit, which I like because this is sort of an overcast, cool scene with these green areas, so I don't want it to be too warm. We can look at a side-by-side example there, so you can see how it cooled it down a little bit, but it kept a lot of the warmth in the cliffs, which is nice. All right, we could also change the tint of the image if you wanted to further add a color cast to it. So if you bring it to the left, you're going to get a cooler green hue, or if you bring it to the right, you're going to get a warmer magenta hue. None of those are really appropriate for this image, so I'm going to leave that alone. My next option is I can go to exposure. And again, because you have a lot of latitude with your raw images, you can overexpose a little bit or underexpose a little bit, and then play with the exposure directly in Lightroom. So right now the background is looking pretty good for exposure. I think it's a little underexposed in this area. I'd like to see a little more detail around the plants and in the shadows on the rocks. So I'm going to bring the exposure up a little bit. I can bring it up a lot if I wanted to, or I can bring it down a lot. I'm going to just crank that up just a little bit so that you can see now I've got a little more detail around the rocks and the shadows. It's a little bright in the background, but I'm going to fix that. So we have a nice brightness that came through in this area. And for me, really what became too bright in here was the highlights and the waterfall. So now I can go down to highlights and I can actually bring that back down. So I can bring it down and I can actually add in detail. If you look at the waterfall in the background, you're starting to see some shading, some tonality come back into it. It's not blown out as it was before. I can show you that before and after. So that's a little overexposed. And then I've brought my highlights down so that I have a little texture and detail. They're not overly white. Okay. I can do this with the shadows as well. If I want to darken them a little bit, I can bring them down. I can bring them up a little bit. I think I want them to just be a touch lighter, just a little more detail in this area. And now this brings us to the whites and blacks. So what we can do is we can actually go up to the histogram over here. And there's 2 points on the histogram we can set. The upper left point is to show shadow clipping. So I can click that. and I'll show you, it doesn't really do too much yet. And then the upper right point, which is the highlight clipping. So we can click that so it's showing the highlight clipping. At the moment, there's one tiny little blue speck here. This is showing me where the shadows are clipped, and it'll show as red to show where the highlights are clipped. So what this means is this is an area that in the highlight range, if it's clipped, it has gone pure white, it has lost detail. In the shadow range, it's gone to pure black and is losing detail. It's clipped. Oftentimes when it's clipped, there will be a heavy fall off. There won't be a nice gradual shift from medium mid-tones into shadows, into blackness. It'll just be a stark black or a stark white. So I do want to see a little bit. So if I bring the black tones down, you notice that the clipping area grows. So anywhere that you see blue, that's showing me where the shadows are clipped. And I do want to have a little bit of clipping just in the darkest blacks. So I'm okay with having a little bit of that show up there. Now in the white areas, if I were to bring that up, we can start to see it turns red where the highlights are clipped, where they go to white. So I do want just a little bit of light white shimmer just on the waterfall there. So I'm just going to have it clipped just a little bit right in that area. Okay. All right. And now I can actually turn this off. I don't really need to see this, just doing this to identify those areas. There we go. All right, and after I've done that, I might go back into my highlights. I might bring that down just a little bit more so I can just pull back in a little detail in those areas. And then now let's look back and forth again. So now we're getting a lot more gradation and tone in your highlights. You're seeing a little more defined edges because of contrast change and clarity. There's a shift in white balance. All right. And next we can go down to clarity, vibrance, and saturation. So clarity, if you bring up the clarity, that will actually just increase the contrast in the midtones. So what will happen is it'll look like the image is getting sharper, but really you're just you're gaining some increase in contrast in those midtone areas. So I'm going to zoom in when I do that. If I bring that up, I'll bring it up quite a bit so you can see the contrast increases. It really doesn't need to be that high for this image. If I bring it down, you can see that things get kind of flat and a little bit muddy. I'm probably not going to do anything for clarity in this image because I really don't think it needs much of that. Vibrance is going to adjust the overall hue. So it'll add a little brightness into the colors. If I go to the extreme, you'll notice that things sort of start to look a little saturated and too vibrant. So I might just bring that up just a touch, just to bump up some of the vibrance in the green tones. And then saturation will be an overall saturation to the image where it'll really strengthen all of the values in the colors, or we can bring it down to flatten everything out. I'm not going to use that. If I wanted to adjust for saturation, I'd actually go to the hue, saturation, and luminance menu, and I would adjust the individual colors because I can get much more fine adjustments from that menu. Okay, and finally, we're going to go down into detail, and we're going to look at the sharpening. And I want to zoom in to do this. You're not really going to see that when you're zoomed out. When your camera is shooting JPEG, it'll automatically sharpen your image. Sometimes you might want to add a little extra sharpening. This will just crisp up the edges. I want to actually look at the plant life down here as I'm sharpening. So this will add just a little extra detail to the image. So if I bring it up really high, you notice that things start to look a little speckled and noisy when I do that. So I'm going to leave this down around 45, and we can look at a before and after there. It's a really subtle difference. It's just happening in between these little fern leaves here, just to give them a little extra edge definition. The radius, I usually say around 1. This is going to affect the amount of pixels that this is applied to. So I can have it reach out and include a range of space that's about 3 pixels, or I can bring it down to nothing, or half a pixel. That won't do much. So we want the reach to be about 1 pixel. All right, and then you can also bump up the detail. As you do that, you're going to be gaining a lot of noise. This is starting to look very staticky, so I don't really need to bring up the detail. If I bring it down, that'll smooth things out. So we're just maintaining some of the details in the edges. And masking is going to do the opposite. So masking is bringing up detail. Detail is bringing up extra fine details in some of the darker areas, where masking is looking at these areas where there's not a lot of information, and if we bring up the masking, it smooths out those areas. We don't need to have sharpening in those areas because there's nothing to sharpen, so we're making sure that those areas stay soft, that there's a nice gradual shift between tones, that the sharpening doesn't make it look overly contrasty and harsh, and that there's an abrupt change from light tones to mid-tones to shadows. And then finally we have noise reduction. So you may have some noise in your image. There are 2 different types of noise. There is luminance, which is an overall noisiness in the brightness of the photo, so there's just an overall sort of speckled look to the photograph, where the color refers to just a random coloring. So you see that sort of around in the blue here, where we have color noise. There's a little color distortion in the photograph. So we could bring the luminance up to smooth out some of the noise. And if we go back and forth, you can see that there's not a huge difference. There's just a slight difference in here. Things become a little smoother, a little less speckled looking. I'm actually going to back this off. It's starting to smooth out too much detail. I want to see nice edge definition here in the falls. And then if I play around with my color noise, I'm going to crank it all the way up to see if I get much of a difference. There's not too much change that's happening here. If I bring it down, we notice there's really not a whole lot of color noise that we're dealing with here. So we don't have to do much with that. All right, and I'm going to zoom out, and we can look at the before and after for the image, and we can see that we have a non-processed raw image on the left and a processed image that you have processed step by step to your own liking. I can continue with this. I can play around with the hue, saturation, and luminance. I can change the color. I can go to the tone curve and I can work on contrast, and I can change the color per channel, red, green, and blue. So all of the usual adjustments that you would do to an image are available when you're editing a raw file, in addition to these adjustments that are specific to raw files. So you have ultimate control when you're working with raw images. You can control exposure, you can control white balance, you can change the sharpness, you can deal with noise, where when you're shooting in JPEG, your camera is making a lot of these decisions for you. And that is how you adjust a raw image in Lightroom.